Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing another episode of History of Horror, the series I am doing on my channel where I tell you about a horror movie icon, all while turning myself into that icon. Today we are going to be talking about probably one of the most adapted characters in the horror scene, and that is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So usually this story is about a man who is in love with a woman, and when we first see him, he is a kind of affluent scientist, well respected in his community, but he also does a lot of experiments that have the potential to go wrong, and that's exactly what happens with him. They go wrong and he ends up turning into a monster, his alter ego, the evil side that lives in all of us, or he kind of hears the voices in his head, very kind of two sides of the same coin situation. So a lot of the horror movies started as books, and this one is no different. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde started as a book in 1886. But the first movie adaptation came out in 1908, and it was a silent film. However, this movie cannot be seen anywhere because the original film has been lost forever. No one knows where it is. It's mainly believed to have been destroyed at some point. And then there was another film in 1909 called A Modern Dr. Jekyll, and that film was also destroyed forever, and no one has any known copies of it anywhere in the world. But most of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde films were made in the early 1900s, between 1908 and 1920, and they were based on the original adaptation of the book. However, this is one of the most heavily adapted films in horror history, so I'm just going to talk to you guys about a few that I've come across that sound really interesting and that you may want to watch in your free time if you want to explore some of these characters deeper. The first movie that I want to tell you about is from 1951. This is The Son of Dr. Jekyll, and is all about Dr. Jekyll's illegitimate son who tries to clear his father's name of his crimes by redoing the experiments that his father did that turned him into Mr. Hyde. So he's basically trying to prove to the public that his father, Dr. Jekyll, was not responsible for these, but the monster that he turned into was responsible, and his father's name should be cleared and all should be put on Mr. Hyde. So it's a very interesting kind of... The plot was very interesting to me just because it sounds kind of like a battle between good and evil, but also a very dangerous game to help the one you love. And then 6 years later, in 1957, we had the Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, which is when a woman finds out that she is Dr. Jekyll's daughter and fears that she also carries the monster of Mr. Hyde within her, and crimes start happening around, I believe it's London, and she becomes worried that she's the one doing the crimes and she just can't remember them, but it very well may be someone else who is doing them. So this one's kind of a mystery, a thriller of, is she really doing it, or is someone making her think that she's doing them? Then in 1960, we have The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, which involves a love triangle. And based on the plot synopsis that I read of this movie, this is one of the most gruesome Dr. Jekyll adaptations ever. So trigger warnings everywhere on this one. There is some drug use, there is some assault, there are some very gruesome murder scenes. So this one is definitely more of a horror than a thriller, but I thought it was important to include because it's the only one I found that explicitly said there is a love triangle involved in this film. Then in 1971, we have the first adaptation to show Mr. Hyde as a woman, and this is the movie Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. In this movie, a scientist is trying to take the hormone that makes women live longer in the film and put it into himself so he can live longer, but ultimately it backfires and he ends up transforming into a woman. But when he turns into Sister Hyde, she is evil, she is a killer, and she is actually revealed to be Jack the Ripper, which I thought was an interesting plot considering there are theories out there that Jack the Ripper wasn't a man but was actually a woman who was a midwife that was killing prostitutes instead of a man who was killing prostitutes. So that one seemed really interesting. 1989, we have The Edge of Sanity. In this one, Dr. Jekyll uses cocaine, and cocaine causes him to turn into Mr. Hyde. Now, this one I think was very much of its time. In the late 80s, people were using a lot of cocaine, and I think it was kind of trying to go for that don't use this drug or it'll turn you evil idea. But it really didn't work, and it's largely known as one of the worst adaptations of the story of all time. Then in 1996, we had the movie Mary Riley, which is about the maid of Dr. Jekyll who becomes intrigued with the doctor's experiments and find out that he does have an alter ego, and she is intrigued by him as well. So she kind of starts falling in love with both of them for their own reasons. And this one has mixed reviews. Some people think it's pretty good, some people think it's terrible. But Dr. Jekyll is played by John Malkovich in this movie, and Julia Roberts is Mary Riley. So it could be good. I mean, they're both very good actors. I haven't seen that one, but that is the most recent one that I think I would want to see. And then in 2006, we have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is based on the original story, so the original 1906 movie, but told in modern times instead of Victorian London when the story was originally written. That is all of the film adaptations I thought sounded interesting, but that is not where this stops. This actually, in my research, I found was broken down into 3 main categories: TV, radio, and stage, and also film. So I guess 4 categories. But this has been put on as a Broadway musical, which was later filmed and put out in theaters. But most of the adaptations that are well known are the TV adaptations. Now, there were a ton that aired on BBC in England, probably because that's where the main story is set. But I did find a few that aired in Canada and the US. That's basically all I have to say about the movies. I did find that there wasn't a whole lot of research done on the makeup or how the character evolved. It just kind of seemed like the character went from a man in love or a man engaged to a mad scientist whose experiment goes wrong to a man that turns into a woman. The story is interesting enough that I think it just kind of lends itself to be remade in several different ways. There's a lot of creative freedom and adaptation, but really nothing about the makeup or how it changed over time. I'm assuming a lot of prosthetics were used. However, a lot of big stars have been involved in the role of the Strange Doctor and Mr. Hyde. And I think this is honestly kind of one of my favorite type of stories. I think the psychological aspects that can be delved into in this kind of story is very interesting. So that is it for today's history of horror. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me paint myself into a kind of lizardy monster on one side of my face, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Next Saturday today's Saturday. Next week on Saturday, I will be giving you another episode of History of Horror since I was so late getting this one up. So be ready, because next week we are talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. So I will see you guys in the next one, and yeah, bye.